This
You stop the
conference will
recording?
now be recorded.
No problem. So when we talk about moving data in and out of Core, Core is the Salesforce Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, Community Cloud space. And anytime you need to move data in any directions, and you need to have, it's an integration. So what we're going to do is I want you to think like an architect, know your options for integrations, know the capabilities of those options. And when I teach my architect classes, I talk about architects being like a ninja, having their tools and knowing which tools work in what scenarios. And when you have a tool, you need to know its strengths, its weaknesses, what it works on, what it doesn't work on. There is a domain out there for the Integration Architecture Designer domain, and this is a certification that will allow you to really focus in on integrations. And I'm kind of using that as like a top-level element to talk about how data goes in and out of Salesforce. There are many of you on this call, and many of you will know more about a certain integration capability than I will. I'm not going to say I know everything about everything, but what I'm here to do is to give you that Chinese menu sampler plate, that like variety plate of how you move data in and out of Salesforce. Hopefully I got most of them. Maybe there's one or two more. I left out the Pardot integration. We can get into that, but we'll go into a minute. So first, web services are one of the large ways of moving data between computer systems. You need to know about the difference between SOAP, being a structured protocol. You should be able to know what a WSDL is for importing a WSDL, know about the SOAP envelope and the XML payload. Also the versions, the SOAP 1.1 and the 1.2 spec. So SOAP is generally, I remember being at Java 1 about 15 years ago, and web service definitions were really coming of age back then. SOAP was the initial one. Then we have REST, really kicked in during the mobility days. It's a lightweight protocol, really follows standard HTTP, messages, the post, the get, the update. And it has a JSON payload, much smaller and lighter. So when you decide you're going to use APIs, web services specifically, you need to be able to know the difference between the SOAP and the REST, the advantages and disadvantages. I was just on a client call yesterday, and they were hosting some endpoints on Microsoft Communication Framework. And I said, can you make it RESTful? Because the moment they make it RESTful, some things happen. I want to be able to call from Salesforce to a Microsoft Communication Framework. And as soon as it's RESTful, I don't need to import the WSDL. I can just do the standard HTTP callouts. I can get a simple JSON and map it. So knowing the difference, anyone dealing with a lot of integrations, you need to be able to instinctively know SOAP versus REST. Go to the next slide. And then whenever you're having two servers talk to each other, it is in a client-server mechanism. People say, oh, it's server to server, but the way I define it is the client is the one initiating the connection. So the client is the one picking up the phone and trying to dial a phone number. The server typically has a listener, may even have a different authentication endpoint, and then they will then have some public methods available. So the client has to authenticate with credentials or a token, typically through OAuth. And then the server responds. Now, it's not a one-directional communication, so data always flows both directions. You call and you can get a response. So I can pass data in, I can get a list of something back. I can submit a list and get an acknowledgement or a success or failure. So the key point is that communications are bidirectional, but they're usually initiated by one side of the communication, one side of the party. Now we're going to move to OAuth. And we could Google OAuth and talk for hours on OAuth. OAuth is a way for the client to authenticate with the server. And then there are typical OAuth methods. Username password is the lowest level. You'll hit an OAuth endpoint, you'll pass in the username and password, and you'll get back your access token. And then you're ready to go. That is not the most secure manner. If you're having two systems, then you can have what's called a client ID and a client secret, and those can be kept secure. Then you'd use web server OAuth flow, and it's a very secure method. For mobility devices, we use user agent flow is the second most secure method for, it's because the client ID and the client secret can't be secured on a mobile device. Somebody could do a memory dump of the mobile device. So you go to user agent flow. And then there's this fun one, JWT, jot flow. And that's where you take an XML message and you wrap it with and you encrypt it with a public private key encryption pair. And then when the client receives the jot token, they open it up with their private key. And if they're able to open it, then they consider it a valid credentials, and inside of there should be the username. So these, and there are more. These are 4. I think they've been adding the IoT auth flows. There's screenless auth flows. There is a whole number of auth flows, and you can Google many of those, on all of them on the web. But these are the main ones we typically run into. Web server for server to server, user agent for mobility, username and password when you absolutely have to, and jot flow for when you've got a secure digital certificate relationship and you don't want to have to be passing credentials. 2 kinds of tokens. Access tokens are usually short-lived, maybe usually measured in a few hours, 6 to 8 hours, and they get you in the door. Now, when that access token expires, some people can have what's called a refresh token, and this can be more long-lived. A long-lived refresh token can be stored on a mobile device, can be stored on the browser, and that way, when an access token expires, meaning you've gone beyond the session token range, then it can detect that with a access token invalid message. And then if the system has a refresh token, it can represent the refresh token to the OAuth endpoint, receive a new access token, and then you can go. Or worst case, if you don't have a refresh token, you may have to pop in and ask the user for a username and password again. So again, we could have a whole talk just on OAuth. But these are the main things. What OAuth methods? Whether you have access tokens, refresh tokens. So now, we're going to be talking about all the menu of ways to call into Salesforce. So there is the standard SOAP web service, and there are 2 WSDL types. There is the enterprise WSDL, which is strongly typed. That means that if you have a custom field on your account object called, business name or business ID, then that will be included in the WSDL. And on the other side, when the client brings in the WSDL, they will have that account with that field. It's very powerful, strongly typed, but it's strongly typed to one org. And if you add a new field, you have to regenerate the WSDL, distribute the WSDL, and have your development team on the client side has to re-import the new WSDL and then take advantage of the new field. So this is very good for talking to one org, and it's a very stable system. You can switch to the partner WSDL. It's a loosely typed WSDL generated from Salesforce, and you have to work in an abstract manner, get an S object and do these abstract get and put methods. The advantage is that this is loosely typed. It'll work on any org, and if your client, the server, in the relationship adds a new field, you're able to take advantage of that immediately. You do not need to update your WSDL. So this is a big choice when you're using standard SOAP. Then you have standard REST, which is the new REST protocol, and there is no WSDL, and you can call in and create, read, update, and access objects. Now you as a programming team can create Apex SOAP, and that's really simple with the global class web service, and now you've got it. And so now you can expose a web service from your org for somebody to consume, and they would need to present to the Salesforce OAuth server, get the token, and then they can call this method. Or they can go RESTful, and you can see that they can do REST resource, they can do HTTP GET, HTTP POST, and they can support these methods. So these are ways for the standard out-of-the-box Salesforce to expose data, and these are the ways for the right code, the Apex SOAP and the Apex REST. If you have a development team that is working in close quarters, you can give, and you're in tight synchron, very tightly synchronized, you can give them the standard REST or the standard SOAP, and then that way they can call directly into your S object. However, if you're talking to another team that's you want to give them a really a solid surface, and you might want to do some post-processing. You might want to stand up your own REST or SOAP web services. So therefore, you can control what they call. They can only call a couple of methods. This way, you don't have to give them access, because the problem with these is these two, the standard SOAP and the standard REST, can give them much more powers in your org than you might like. And whichever method you choose, you definitely want to have an integration user with a very locked down access, prevents logging into the console, only gives them access to the objects and fields that you want them to have. So this is calling into Salesforce Web Services. Now we're going to do is we're going to go, there's a whole bunch of other endpoints not everyone knows about. And they have very focused purposes. And I thought we'd at least share many of these with you, or all of these with you. You have the streaming API. And this is straight from the help text. It's a way, if you're monitoring something for change outside of Salesforce and you want to call, has anything changed? Has anything changed? Has anything changed? That can hit a lot of API calls. And a lot of times you're making calls that are receiving no data. So with the streaming API, you can set up the technology like PubSub, where someone from the outside, client from the outside, can subscribe to a channel. They can get those messages and get any messages that might have changed. This can work from the client side. You could have a little browser control that's monitoring and has a little flag when something happens inside of Core, or it can be an outside server that's listening, and when something happens inside of Core, they can get that data. So this is good for listening for things, wanting a quick response without having to bombard the API. So that is the streaming API. Then we have the bulk API. The bulk API is if you want to do data loads or data manipulations in bulk. So it follows RESTful principles. You load it, you create a job, send your data in batches, close the job, and you can even check the status or abort the job. And this is how, if you're doing large amounts of data. And then you definitely want to lean towards the bulk API 2.0. So this is a very common one. The data loader uses the bulk API. A lot of technology stacks use the bulk API to bring data into Salesforce. And the bulk API 2.0 can really bring in your hundreds of thousands or millions of records if you need to. We have the metadata API. This is where your IDEs use in order to call into Salesforce, create objects, create fields, do all of your metadata manipulations. And you typically will use like an ant or deploy to migrate code. Now, years ago when this first came out, I've actually talked to people where we've worked on having one Salesforce org call back into itself and manipulate itself. So we were able to, through a proxy, to be able to like dynamically create fields on the fly in your own org without having to be a developer. So that way you can actually manipulate yourself. It was a very little intricate, not as necessary these days, but the point is it is an endpoint. You can authenticate and you can make calls to it. So that could be powerful if you want an application that, one org that controls another org and seeds it, one org that even could potentially control itself. So there's a lot of interesting things, but kind of Inception-like, so you got to be a little cautious. But that is manipulating the structure of the metadata. We have the tooling API. It's another API for fine-grained or metadata access. It can be for things like the metadata API, but it's much more focused, retrieving data about fields, properties. You can run test classes. You can download debug logs. So the tooling API is, I think of it as a Swiss Army knife for developers for calling into Salesforce. You ought to Google it. And on any of these, all you have to do, it's the simplest thing. I'm going to bring up a browser. You just go Salesforce tooling API, click it, and boom, you can learn all about what it does, how to access it, and advantages. So on any of these, you can go Salesforce Streaming API and get the limits. And the point I'm going to show you is you're only a Google sentence away. Just knowing that just knowing what it's called, you can quickly get all the details you need. But this one is about, think of that as dev tools. Now let's keep going here. The Chatter API came out when Salesforce came up with Chatter. It was the big thing, and you wanted to be able to have open Chatter up to external apps. It's a little, I haven't seen it as much. I've actually written some custom apps that use the Chatter API about 4 or 5 years ago. Haven't seen as much, but it does exist, and it is a way for third-party apps to reach into the Chatter API, pull the feed, and read and write to the feed. Quick note, you want to get to Salesforce files, this could be a way to get to Salesforce files through the Chatter API. So just calling that there is a Chatter API, and you can use it. All of these are ways to call into Salesforce from an external client. Now, we're going to flip it. You're inside of Salesforce, and you want to call out. So the old school method is a SOAP call out, and that's where you would take your WSDL and run from the client. Now Salesforce is the client, so you're going to get a WSDL from a third party. You're going to run the WSDL to Apex. It'll generate some classes, which are kind of ugly. And you get a bunch of like 6 or 8 classes to populate inside of your Apex classes. You can call them. You do have to think about getting your test code coverage because these classes are Apex classes. They do count against your test code, and it can be kind of a pain in the bottom in order to get the good test code penetration into them. Quick note, Salesforce does not support the latest SOAP spec. So if you're trying to call out from Salesforce to the latest SOAP spec, you won't be able to do it. You won't have a lot of the features of the SOAP. I think it's a SOAP 1.2 protocol. So this will work really just for the SOAP 1.1 protocol. If you need to reach a SOAP 1.2, we actually had a client that needed to call out to SOAP REST, and one of the endpoints we needed to call was to SOAP 1.2. The end was only SOAP 1.2. There was no way to change it. So we actually had to go from Salesforce to Heroku and through one REST call out that we wrote, and we had a bunch of code sitting in Heroku that then could call SOAP 1.2, SOAP 1.1, REST. So it became a hop to Heroku and then a fork out to all the other integration partners. So that's a situation where, yes, you could use MuleSoft, yes, you could use any of the other integration patterns, but if you're just looking for a point-to-point, be careful trying to hear the latest SOAP spec. You can't use it. So that's using the SOAP callout. Let us go to outbound messages. This is old school. This is a really old school way of having data triggered by a workflow rule, and it can send data from a single object, typically like an account, opportunity, some other object. And what it can do is there is a change on like your account object, you can have it make a call out. It creates an asynchronous message, drops it in a queue, and the key point is you hand your external server. This is a case where Salesforce is the client. You're calling a server on the other side, and Salesforce produces a WSDL that the server has to consume, and it can work. It's a way to get data out asynchronously. It's not real time. It's near real time. And you can even have a callback where you can check a little box and it can include the session ID. And then that way, when that SOAP Web Services receives that an account has changed or an order has changed, or an opportunity has changed, it can then use that session to call back in and get like additional records, like children records. So that's important. So key points are the endpoint has to support SOAP, and those are some of the parameters. So it is a good old school way of getting data change out of Salesforce to, let's say you want to update an accounting system. You might have a little listener that catches that and then respond. Okay. Now, HTTP call out. HTTP call out is a generic method which works really well for REST. You can use it for SOAP, but you've got to build your own XML SOAP envelope. You've got to build your request envelope, and you have to XML parse the response envelope. The nice thing is if you can do that and you got some XML manipulation, you can get kind of your hands deeper into it and not have to rely on the WSDL generated classes. Or you can just make straight HTTP and do like screen scraping and scrape other sites. So this protocol is a very straightforward protocol, but it works really well with the REST. Create a JSON payload, make a REST call out, get the HTTP response, process it, and you're good to go. So this is your Swiss Army knife, which covers your REST. I know we're moving. There's a lot of little different ways in, and it's funny, there are more ways in, less ways out. There are a couple more. What we're going to do is, now we're going to talk about call outs. I am inside of Salesforce and I want to call out. Well, I need to know where I'm going to. Salesforce restricts that, so you might have remote site settings, which would be, what IP addresses you can reach out to. You're going to need to have username and passwords. You certainly don't want to store them hard-coded. Where do you put username and passwords inside of Salesforce for call out? You can store that in named credentials. You might have client-side certificate where Salesforce is calling out, Salesforce is the client, so therefore you might need a Salesforce stored client certificate. You just need to know limitations of calling out. And I'm not talking about limits on API, number of APIs, but you need to know you can't run it from a trigger. You need to know long-running call-outs. How do you run test code coverage? Do you write calls from the pages from Apex? How would you think about your vision, like an old school Visual Force? You'd have a Visual Force, press a button, make a synchronous call out, wait for a response, but then the thread's held up. Maybe with Lightning, you might put a spinner on the page and have, your ability to spawn, thread handlers and wait and monitor and then have it come back. So the key is just being able to know how you're going to process that when you do these call outs. Now, there is old school Salesforce to Salesforce, being able to configure users and connections and invite, and I'm misspelling, and accept. You would publish and share records. So if you have your org and maybe your company has two orgs, you could share some records between them. Or as it originally they came up with, it was a way to kind of share records between a partner orgs. Now let's talk about Salesforce Connect. This is an interesting trait. Lightning Connect, Salesforce Connect, accessing data. So it creates data as _X's. It uses OData. Now these are really neat because these can show up on reports and page layouts. The key element is it batches the data in sets 2000, and there are limits on reporting. The key thing is if you were doing like an account with child invoices and those invoices were held in an off-platform system, let's assume you had 100 million invoices across, you had 1 million clients and you had every invoice for the last 20 years, you wouldn't want all those old invoices and details sitting inside a Salesforce Core, just sucking up storage. So you could have this as an external object. Top level one was your account, and then it had a key to your invoices. Now, a key thing is then when you're grabbing, it's going to grab the sets of 2000 and be fine. But if you wanted to scan all those invoices, you wanted to go to that _X object and scan the entire 50 or 100 million, if you weren't starting with a top level key, it will then try to do chunks of 2000 and actually time out on big queries. So it's good for child records where the parent sits inside of Salesforce. Not as good when you just have 100 million of something and you're trying to do random queries against it. We've set this up for connections between Salesforce point-to-point and SAP, where the SAP can open up an endpoint task and we can make calls. So I've seen this work to SAP, I've seen this work to custom. There's many different ways you can make this work, and then you don't have to reside the data in Salesforce, and you can show it up on your reports and page layouts. Now, some people see Heroku Connect, Salesforce Connect, Heroku Connect. A lot of people get them mixed up. Heroku Connect is not really an integration method, and it's not really about large data because it's a bidirectional synchronization between Salesforce and Heroku that keeps two, and you take an object in Salesforce, and I'm going to go through the steps. You take an object in Salesforce, an S object, you create a new Postgres table. You cannot point it to an existing Postgres table. It has to be new. It's going to synchronize all rows. You cannot filter the number of rows you're synchronizing. You can control the field, but you can't send formula fields. And it either uses the streaming API or the bulk API. I actually had a case where we were looking for instantaneous updates, and all of a sudden we noticed that it was starting to go from instantaneous to 2-minute batches. And what happens is if you get to a certain point, Heroku Connect will automatically switch from the streaming API to the bulk API with 2-minute frequencies, and then you might not know it if you're not monitoring the logs. A nice thing is it doesn't count against your API limit. So that's a selling point, is you can have change back and forth synchronized, and you can use it as kind of a bridge that's immune of API limit immune. So that is Heroku Connect. And now we're going to go to platform events, the new shiny bauble everybody loves to talk about. This is where you can have, it's an event-driven platform. It's events both inside of Salesforce, events outside of Salesforce. You can publish for the events, listen for them, catch the event. You can subscribe to events. This is like the whole new event paradigm. So this is a very exciting place people are going with getting data in and out of Salesforce. So if you're looking for something, now it is event-driven, so it's not request response, so you're not going to get instantaneous. And it has to be somebody that's going to be working with the event team. So if they're already working with like a Kafka message bus, you're going to be able to tap into one of those systems and get things going. But if you have like an old SOAP or REST, this is more where things are moving, event-driven. Now you can be listening to standard events and move data around inside your core org using standard events. Big questions are, what's in the payload? Do you stick the full message or just like a reference to a customer? And is there a callback to get the full? So this, you could have a whole talk just on platform events. All right, so that is your Chinese menu. And what I wanted to stop with is, there are many ways of taking data in and out of Salesforce. And in your given day, and even on a project, you may only use one or two. But you need to know all of the ones as an architect, know all of the possible methods, know which ones are relevant, and be able to pull it out. Again, this is just a sampler place. We can dive into more detail, but I hope this was helpful. One, get to know the totality of the platform. And two, someday you're going to need to call, a SOAP, a REST. Someday you're going to need to be polling Salesforce. Someday you're going to, somebody's going to say Salesforce or Heroku Connect, and you're going to, because of large data volumes, no, it's not Heroku Connect. That's Salesforce Connect. So these are all the tools or weapons in your armory. So I just wanted to share with you. So I'll stop and we can have a discussion or questions.
Yeah, that was awesome. I have a question.
Thank you very much. Fire away.
I love the whole thing. I just wonder if you could offer an overlay across those methods of things that consume API calls versus don't consume API calls, things that are like API call efficient versus API call inefficient, just because I think that would be a helpful overlay.
Yeah, the API, it's funny, people go and I keep waiting for the day that they're going to go and give MuleSoft like a free pass.
They might.
But that would be like if they say anything on MuleSoft, you have no API limit. But just because I think then that would give them their own competitive advantage. But other than that, the reason I bring it up is all your inbounds really count against API limits. I have a client that was calling a custom REST that we stood up, and we were receiving updates. And we were receiving, it's a client where we were receiving, we were about 100,000 records a day. The problem was then anytime it changed on their side, we were getting changes. So we ended up getting like 200,000 a day. And so we were getting near their API limit. We asked them if they could batch them into groups of 1 or 200. Because if you're calling into Salesforce, you can send one record or you can send a whole list. But then they were actually, I know it's funny, they had their own internal event bus. And as they caught events, they were feeding them into us because their event bus was private in their network, and then they were calling. But the point is, they could only send a singular records, and then they were sending records every time there was a change. So their 100,000 incomings became 200,000 API, and we were worrying about API limits. So any of the SOAPs and REST all consume API endpoints. I think only the Heroku Connect I'm aware of kind of bypasses the API limits. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's right.
So
I think
everybody,
that's helpful.
Outbound is free. You can make all the outbound you want, so that there is no limit on an outbound other than Are you how are you spawning outbound? If you're spawning outbound from a page, you got to wait for it. If you're spawning it asynchronous, I've seen a client where you try to like bombard an constantly hit another system. I've seen clients where their asynchronous Apex queue suddenly gets saturated. So going out is free, but you're going to be more tied up in your Apex threads. Inbound is definitely metered, and it's a rolling 24-hour period, if that's helpful.
That's really interesting that Heroku Connect versus MuleSoft, that Heroku doesn't really have the limits that MuleSoft does.
Well, MuleSoft uses the standard API. MuleSoft is on the same level as Boomi, Jitterbit. They all have to hit the same API endpoints and are on the same limit. My point was when they invented Heroku Connect, they kind of gave you a backdoor synchronization layer. And that was like a key selling point. You know, it'll synchronize, it doesn't count against your API limit. But everybody else comes in through the API limited back doors, if that makes sense.
That's interesting. We are taking, well, first let me introduce myself. I met Corey at Dreamforce, but I don't think I know anyone else here. My name's Melissa. Hey, Corey. My name's Melissa Mueller. I'm the leader of the Atlanta Developers Group. I've been in the ecosystem for 3 years. I'm a software engineer at Mitsubishi Electric Trane HVAC. And we just formed a joint venture 2 years ago with Trane. And we are finally getting able to take over our computer systems from what I call the mothership. In Japan, Mitsubishi is a defense contractor. So we have never been able to connect directly to SAP. We're breaking ties and initiating our own SAP instance. And I've really been trying to learn as much as I can about event-driven architecture. And as a matter of fact, Misty Jones and Gene Valonis told me to get in touch with both you, Marissa and Steve, because Jitendra Zha told me that you guys had an excellent presentation about an event-driven architecture at Cactus Force. Something about flipboards. And I want to know as much as I can in the integration that you're talking about. And we're looking at MuleSoft. We haven't looked at it very heavily yet, but Jitendra told me, he said, don't use a company name. Don't say MuleSoft, don't say Heroku, because my first lean was towards Heroku. He said, use the phrase ESB, because that way, if they push back on your idea, it's not because you mentioned a specific company that was too expensive, that you were using a general phrase. And I'm just wondering, hearing you now talk about Heroku Connect, we're going to be connecting our operations in SAP, which processes orders, to our Salesforce experience, which displays our order statuses to 20,000 community users and 500 internal users. And we have many orders each day. So we'll have lots and lots and lots of inbound stuff that I want to handle through, I think should be handled through events. And you're making me lean towards giving a company name. Can you help me figure out whether I should mention a company name or stick by what Jitendra said?
So you've thrown a lot of things out there, and so we'd definitely be happy to chat with you about this without going deep into this. But let's talk about, you're talking about SAP. You're talking about now, are you going to be sending updates to SAP, or are you going to be receiving updates from SAP, or are you going to be doing more of a bi-directional handshake of synchronization? So is it a push to SAP, a pull from SAP, or a keep SAP in?
Currently, all our orders come in to our order department directly to SAP. And we pull through an API into Salesforce the order statuses. What the business is looking to do is to build an order, a request in Salesforce, because we have both our distributor and our contractor communities in Salesforce. So we'd like them to be able to order direct. The first step will be pushing from SAP into Salesforce, and then hopefully eventually pushing orders from Salesforce into SAP and having their status updated from the SAP to Salesforce. I'm sorry, I know it's a lot. I apologize.
No, not at all. Not at all. And this may be relevant to other people. Give me just 1 second. Here we go. And I'm just putting something on the screen. So if you were talking about, here is Salesforce, and I do this on the fly in my working, there is me as a developer group and me in my working day. So here is SAP. And so my question for you is, are you trying to push to SAP, or are you trying to receive from SAP? What do you want to have happen?
Initially, before we take the next step in processing orders in Salesforce, initially we just want to be able to pull data from SAP about the order statuses and serve it up on Salesforce.
Okay, so it does SAP, first we're going to assume, now you always need to decide, are you going to try to do this point to point, meaning Salesforce talking to SAP, or are you going to do some form of a middleware? You know, a form of a middleware could be the MuleSoft, could be the Jitterbit, could be all of that. Or are you going to go point to point? There are ways to go point to point. Salesforce calls a web service on SAP, and then you get the responses. And you can pull, you can push. So your simplest point, and I'm just cleaning this up right here, your simplest thing that may not be where you want to grow to is, do you want to call SAP if they have an exposed web service and pull that data? That's one option. Or you go in and you stick in a middleware. You know, let's say I'll just go middleware. And this could be Jitterbit, MuleSoft, anything else. And then your middleware actually can sit, and it's the orchestrator of your event. So it will go and push into Salesforce, and it can even have polling tasks that can pull from SAP. So what you're recommended to use the word ESB. Now it's funny, I used to use ESB to represent middleware, but it's funny is if you talk, my company is now MuleSoft certified, and every time we work with MuleSoft, they're like, don't say ESB. We're not an ESB. We're an API orchestration layer. And so the word ESB is kind of falling out of vogue. Does that make sense? So call it a middleware if you need a middleware. Now, Heroku is something different. Heroku sits in a unique paired relationship. And I always, when I do Heroku, I make it purple. So here's Heroku. And then I love to make my things pretty. So I go Heroku logo, just grab this. And my diagram's in 2 seconds. Copy image. No, you want one without a background. Where is it? There we go. Copy image. So in 2 seconds, I go like here, scale it. And then now I got my little Heroku. So the point I'm going to say is, so here's my little Heroku. Now, Heroku does have that unique relationship where your API limits. So that's, if I were monitoring for change, then what I would do is I would have a Heroku database and go from there. So my question is, you're trying to go from Salesforce to SAP. If you were just doing a pull, you might go point to point. If you were looking to grow into the future, you might want to bring in a middleware. Now, MuleSoft is a wonderful product. It is expensive. It starts, you know, it has an opening beginning price that's higher than the others. But I again, being MuleSoft certified company, I can tell you the approach for building complex systems and the layers of APIs, I think MuleSoft is great. So anything where you think you're going to grow into a lot of complexity, it's a great product. If you were just starting at the low level, it might be, you know, a big gun when all you need is a pea shooter. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, we have 3 people on a team who write C# APIs to push to a database that gets every night SAP pushes to that database and our API team pulls it into Salesforce. So we're looking to eliminate that database in the middle and have be able to push pull. And we're talking about tens of thousands of orders each week. So it needs to be able to scale.
Then you might want to, looking into MuleSoft, even though it has that initial price that can be a little daunting, not for a small company. I think you're going to save in the long run on writing a bunch of C# code versus MuleSoft code. And I run a team that is MuleSoft certified, and second, I'm about to sit for my MuleSoft certification, so I'm pretty fresh on it. And so I would say if you're looking at an ongoing effort with a lot of maintaining code, I would say you might want to really look into the MuleSoft option because of the layering of the APIs helps that. And I know that's kind of beyond our talk, and I know we've been focusing on this above everyone else, but it is around integrations. Now, in the end, then when you're in MuleSoft, it will be reaching into Salesforce. It can call into the REST. It can call into the SOAP. Heck, if you were sending in 500,000 records, you may choose to send into the bulk API. So, so we were talking about the gates at the boundaries, but from another talk would be the middleware. Platform events is its own animal. If you're talking about ingesting, hundreds of thousands of orders, that to me is not a platform event problem. A platform event problem would be you are monitoring for change over here, and every now and then somebody changed something, and they broadcast the message, and you wanted to capture it and update Salesforce. So platform events may not be the best one. This might be more like a straight middleware solution, if that's helpful.
Okay, can I just ask one more question?
Sure.
Why is your Heroku not connected to SAP? Is it just because you're more fresh with MuleSoft and you were focused?
So let's talk about Heroku is a passive layer. And so in the end, you're going to have Heroku. You're going to have a database. Let me put a little shape here. Shaped. Where's my cylinders? Cylinders. So here. So I'm going to end up with a little cylinder right here. And I'm going to go and say that Heroku is a layer. And I'm going to use Heroku Connect, which will connect to here. So now I'm going to have an S object here. And let's call it, what is it, like an order database?
Yeah.
An order. And then I'm going to have an order, and I'm going to call that a _C, or it could be a out of the box Salesforce standard object order. And then I'm going to have an order, and I'm going to call it an order _H, just to represent it's on Heroku. It won't actually have that. Then my question is, so now this is sitting here, then how are you going to get that to connect to SAP? Heroku does not instinctively out of the box connect to SAP. Now what you're going to be doing is, are you going to be making a call? So now I'm going to end up with a little piece of code right here that I'm going to write. So I'm just going to put code.
So basically, it would be like replacing the database that's in between our Salesforce and SAP instance with a Heroku database, as opposed to the one that they're already using. And they'd still have to have outside API calls. Yes.
Now, the advantage of this is how does SAP fill up that database right now?
Unfortunately, I'm not on the team that does that. I focus solely on sales.
Maybe you can always ping me separately, and we can have a call outside this user group meeting, and we can go into more detail. I'd be happy to have a chat with you.
Yeah, no, you've given me a lot of information. I really appreciate that, Steve. Hopefully it helped others, and we didn't just I didn't monopolize the whole thing.
Not at all. And again, there's our night job of being the dev leaders. There's my day job. You can reach to me in either context, day job or night job. Reach out to me, and I can see if I can help you. But right now, it's not about selling work. It's about helping people with problems, and even just showing you how to, what are your options and how to think of them. So let's see, does anybody else have any questions about the integration?
I see there is a question posted on by Josh on message chat.
I have a question. I can't use my mic. I have 3 different CSVs for an external legacy that need to go into 3 custom objects. That need to go in 3 custom. These objects are connected by a third junction. Question's good. So you have 3 different CSVs from an external legacy system that need to go into 3 custom objects daily. And you got to be doing the joins. Can I use it? You know, let's take the last one. Can I use external IDs through a data loader? Yes. The data loader has an interesting paradigm to be able to load it. It's a little sensitive. So can you use the typical external API and load that up and have it be able to do lookups? Yes. Sometimes though, I just write a little bit of code that can do the lookups. So I'm looking at the steps. I need to import the object, return the Salesforce IDs, and import the object too, return the Salesforce IDs. So yeah, it can get intricate. So I've seen a couple of different ways for this. One, you can do all of this outside of Salesforce. And you can actually write a little program and it can do your first level inserts, get your keys, do your back and forth. Other approaches, I've seen people create temporary objects in Salesforce. So what you do is you first just import them direct into like a holding object, and then you process them, do your lookups in Apex code. But then I'd worry about the volume. So there are just a lot of different approaches. So middleware is less about this. It's more like so your MuleSoft is and I'm just using that just because it's the mainstream Salesforce tool. Your MuleSoft is more around integrations, not around like your data manipulations, ETL, extract, transact, load. So I would say do it in code outside of Salesforce, reaching in and out. I would say load it into Salesforce Node Object, then do your manipulations there, or use like an ETL tool. I hope that's helpful. All right.
Okay,
Yeah.
Steve, I have a general question. So while preparing the landscape, system landscape, you are using the logos from the online, right? So is there any limitations like any patents we have to see, or we can use any online logos while building this system landscape?
Well, I'm not trying to build these and sell these. I'm just using them in diagrams. So I'm not going to publish them. And these are general logos for products that are out there. And I'm using them in context. So I have yet to be, I have yet to have any problems, but I'm not like writing I'm not writing a document or publishing a website. If you're going to use Salesforce on your website or anything public, I'd definitely make sure you follow their branding guidelines. But for a system landscape, drop it in Heroku or Salesforce, or, you know, heck, it takes you 2 seconds to sit there and, you know, SAP logo. I do this in 2 seconds. I find the one with doesn't have the white background, do copy. I use Google Draw. I use the Google Draw because I can distribute that amongst my team. You know, you can go and substitute this, and then at the end of the meeting, you can go File, Download as a PDF or a PNG, and now immediately you have something that you can turn around and send to your client. So you can send them a static image. You can do that, or you can have your team share around. So I just wanted to share you, I live and breathe Google Draw. I can whip up one of these in the middle of a phone call, and I end the call and they go, that's exactly what I want, and I've got it. So that's just a tool I use.
Real-time data architecture, I love it.
Thank you.
No problem.
I have a question, and I have a statement. I don't know how valuable the statement is, but since it's kind of new and it's related to integration in some sense, I felt like it's worth mentioning because I've had some success with it. You can, when receiving payloads, so like let's say you have something that you can get into a JSON structure to send to a RESTful resource, rather than going through some complicated Apex, you can essentially convert that to the new Apex defined data types and pass that to a flow, and then you can do whatever logic you might want to do through a flow, which is pretty neat as well. So I've done that with some stuff that's been pretty neat. for what it's worth.
Great. Yeah, no, there's so many ways to do so many things. Yeah, keep going. Share with us.
But one of the questions I had that you mentioned earlier about when you do the integrations, having an integration user and then restricting the permissions and things like that. How does the licensing work for that? Do you have to have a full license for this, fake user, so to speak?
So the answer is yes, and that's always a challenge. If you get to a client that has hundreds of licenses telling them to use one as the integration user, works fine. If they're like a 10-user org and they're going, why do I have to burn a one for an integration user? They go, let me just use my user, and then they go and use their credentials, and then you have this data flowing behind the scenes, and then one day they forget their password, so they hit that password reset button, and boom, the integration stops working. And so that is the challenge of somebody's going to make a call into Salesforce. They need to initiate a session token. They being even a computer system. They need to have some kind of privileges, and those need to be linked to a user. Does that make sense?
Yeah, what if there's multiple applications? Do you use the one integration user and just keep expanding whatever access there needs to be, or you have to get a new license for every single one of those?
That's a really good point. So if you don't want to have too many licenses, now each user gives fingerprints of created by and changed by. So the great thing is when the records are created or updated or modified, you get to see that it was done by the integration user. So that's nice. Now, if you have two different systems and they share the integration user, then you're going to leave one set of fingerprints. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, but what I suggest is if you have two different applications coming in, don't just create a profile that's the super profile for both. I recommend the following. Create a very, very thin profile, a profile with no capability, and then create a permission set for the first application and a permission set for the second application. So that way you know, and name it the app. So if you have SAP coming in, then I would have the SAP integration permission set. And if you had Workday, I would have the Workday integration permission set. And you can add both those permission sets to the integration user, but then that way you can manage exactly what's the minimum. You always want to have the minimum set of credentials necessary for an integration user to do its job. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah,
So that's what I do.
Yeah,
I have one integration. Go ahead.
Yeah, in that case, I think you want to investigate using middleware and then using a single user, like an integration user service account. But like Steve said, you want to know what system is feeding what data in. So each of those call-ins, when you update records, you're going to say the source system for this update is SAP or Oracle or the order entry system or something like that. But that's a great middleware use case that you're talking about. I wouldn't want to have more than one system, because it's one day it's 2 systems, and then it's 8, and then it's 20, and then a URL changes, username and password changes, and then nothing works, and then you've got to find somebody from these 20 different systems to update your credentials.
Yeah.
So if you centralize that, use a proxy, the middleware proxy, then you're simplifying things for the future.
In the end, if you're going to end up with if you're going to do a Salesforce point-to-point, you can go on your own. If you're going to do 2 points, you can do on your own. In the end, if you start to get to 4, 5, 6 endpoints, you're going to end up with middleware. And again, I'm kind of preference to MuleSoft if you can afford it. And then just as Mike said, you can have one integration user, which is your MuleSoft endpoint user. You can give it pretty decent, powerful permissions, and then the MuleSoft will then do all of that fingerprinting for you. And like exactly as you said, you can even have an extra field called source. So those are great patterns that you can end up in.
We have some smaller integrations with the websites and little forms and things like that that I don't know that they would require too much of a platform, which is why I was trying to keep it small. We've even looked at I've seen recently you can make your API, your Apex API public, and so that there's not an authentication necessary at all. I'm not sure how familiar with that, but with it, I was wondering, what was I going to say? I'm sorry, I'm losing my thought trying to keep up with what you guys just said.
So you're saying Salesforce, Apex, web service, public.
Yeah, you can make
public.
Yeah, so we have, for example, a site right now that can request data and display it. And it could be location data, for example, where we're just wanting to plot some of our locations rather than maintaining them in a WordPress database. We would just pass the updated information straight from Salesforce and let it plot it.
Well, are you just using sites? I mean, exposing sites for a RESTful endpoint would be really easy. I think that's probably what you're talking about. But go ahead, yeah. So yeah, I would worry about DOS denial. Whenever you open something up without any form of authentication, you are opening yourself up for, DOS, denial of service, attacks, things along those lines. But yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
And technically, that is using a user account. Anytime you create a site, there's a user account that goes along with that. It's that site guest user. So the permissions assigned to that user are the things that your public-facing website now has access to in your org.
Is that site user count as a license then?
It's not one that you get charged for. I think every org has 25 sites. I think that number is right. And you don't get charged for that site guest user. It's not an additional one that you're going to pay Salesforce for.
Could you use those site users as your integration users and attach profile?
Nope.
Let me turn my camera on.
They have no credentials.
Be cringing.
Yeah.
Very dangerous.
I would think of a site user as a public front door, and you need to worry about, who's coming in. Are they going to hit you? If you're doing a nice site, you might want to put a CAPTCHA on there. So use the sites carefully. That's an interesting tool that's out there, but I would not use my sites user as, if I were exposing data to unknown people, yes, I could do a sites user, and you could think of it as a public page, but it just returns JSON data. JSON data. So then it's walking like a duck, acting like a duck, therefore it's like a public web service. But I would still worry about who's coming in and what they're doing. But any kind of an integration user, I would have them come in through an integration API. I'd have them come in through an integration user.
Got it.
I would
One
wonder.
thing I've noticed.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries. One thing I've noticed, if you try to overload an integration user by connecting a lot of systems through the same one, right, you can get into reclock situations. I've had to kind of divide out my integration users before just because they were stepping on each other. So just something to be aware of.
Good point. You also want to know that you are throttled not just by API calls, but by login requests. So we had this client that was sending the 100,000 records singularly. They were actually calling them by logging in, submitting the data, and dropping the session token. Logging in, submitting the record, dropping the session token. And they actually maxed out the org on number of login attempts. So we had to have the other side teach them about refresh tokens. So we said, hold on to a session token and try to reuse it between events. Does that make sense?
I can't imagine the cost that was associated with that.
The cost associated with what? Finding the problem and fixing it?
Well, both the logins and finding the problem and fixing it. We just switched about 10,000 partner logins users over to community users because of the cost of the logins, and I can imagine that both affected that company.
So first, we're talking about logins to the API layer, calling a SOAP or calling a REST. So if you call a SOAP, it doesn't consume a community license, and you get a pool of logins in a 24-hour rolling period. You get a base amount, and then you get additional for every user in your org. And there's actually, depending on the user type, you get a little more API calls. So, a 10-user org has like a low level. A 500-user org has a bigger level. A number of API calls allowed in a 24-hour period. But you are throttled by number of login attempts in a 24-hour period. So you want that calling system to hold on to the session token and reuse it, and not just keep re-authenticating for everyone.
Makes a lot of sense.
Do you know if you can, if I have an OAuth, and so users in the org tend to, let's say, only have set permissions, but when they are doing something through this integration, we want to elevate their permissions to do something. Is that possible to essentially, because they came through the API, elevate their permissions?
Well, no, you're going to have given that user a profile and permission set, and they are going to be bound by the restrictions of that profile and permission set.
Okay.
So are you saying just knowing they came in through the API backdoor that we're going to elevate them? No, I don't know how you would. Elevating a person is by granting them more capabilities, and I don't know. I wouldn't have a way to give them more as an API user and less as a user interface user. I'm not aware of that.
Like just in my mind, I was thinking like from Apex running as, you know, some elevated user or something.
So what you're saying is they come in through Apex and then run as the system context.
Yeah.
Would we do that? Yeah, you can cheat and do that. So can you have that do you want to give them the superpower? So now you're asking for something different, which is, can they come in as user A, and then can my Apex shift to the system context, which can then run as the system user and give them ability to go beyond? Yes, that's feasible. Dangerous? You got to know what you're doing. It's in the developer 1 and, you know, I think the developer 2 tests. There's some quizzes on that, but yes, you can definitely do that.
Okay.
I mean, one thing that can be helpful is, you know, if your integration users all share a similar profile, you might want to use that fact as a means of exempting them from things like, you know, rules, validation rules, you know, things.
Oh, I think we lost him. Is it me?
Yes,
He
but
leaned back too far.
not to cut them off, but running a system context is a way to elevate. Once it comes in, run a system context. You know, the without sharing, you can then run as the elevated context. Not with the run as, but with an elevated context. But it won't get you around validation rules. That won't work. The way to get around validation rules is to have written into the validation rule, if not this user, or if not, and which is a bad one because that's hard coded, but if not some attribute on the user, so that way certain users of a certain attribute are immune. So you were right in all the contexts except for the validation rule. It's just a different way to short circuit your validation rule. Who's next?
Steve, I have one question related to authentication. So in my project, we have a Jenkins pipeline to connect Salesforce for the deployment. So we have, I just have one question, like what is the suggested authentication process I can use? Currently, they are using username password flow. I'm thinking of using the reference token flow. If I think of a reference token, does it come under a web server agent or user server agent? As per the documentation, they said like if the client app is not secured, then you should not use. Then you should use only web server agent. Otherwise, you have to use user agent flow. So can you shed
So
some light on? Yeah, sorry.
my question is going to be, who is logging in? Is it a system logging into Salesforce, or is it a user logging into Salesforce with a system?
It's a Jenkins pipeline.
So it's a behind the scenes. It's a server, right?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. And so the reason I bring that up, like you'll use like user agent flow where you're holding a mobile device and you want them to log in to an app that talks to Salesforce, but you don't want to touch the credentials. So you'll pop user agent flow and pop up a login screen on Salesforce. Salesforce grabs the password and passes back. So user agent flow is great for mobile device authentication.
Okay.
If you're doing server to server, you could use, you know, the downside of the now server to server could just be username and password flow, or you could set up like JWT flow, JWT flow, where you have the public private key and it just kind of comes in. You can set that up through what's called a connected app. So you could definitely do that. So I would say you're probably fine if it's a server talking in, and it's a server just talking in to push. You're probably fine with the username and password. Where are your credentials stored? How secure are they? Or maybe think about if you use a JWT flow, you've got to have Salesforce hold the public private key certificate. Your host system has to have it. You wrap it. So in the end, you're still storing things and having to keep them secure. So in that case, server to server, I guess username and password might be just fine. Does that make sense?
Yes, the problem we are facing is the password is getting expired after 90 days. So we are just, the Jenkins pipeline, automation pipeline is getting failed. That is why I was trying to use it, refresh token flow. So in order to use the refresh token flow, then I need to store the client secret, consumer key, consumer secret in the Jenkins script. Though I am encrypting it, is that the suggested approach to use, or is there any, that is my
You're talking
question.
about the refresh now, yeah. And then the other thing is are you using like an integration user for this? And you could give them their own profile and have
Yes,
their
yes,
password
exactly.
settings be different. But you could give them a different profile and set up. But yeah, it definitely will need to handle the refresh, having the refresh token and handling that. I'd have to go into a little more detail. I don't think I can answer your question right here on the spot.
Okay,
But
that's fine. Thank you.
no problem. There's a whole class on OAuth. I was teaching at the boot camp for Dreamforce. They have that architect boot camp, and I was teaching one, and there was like a whole day session we would teach on integrations, and almost half of the day for like 4 hours we would teach just on OAuth. And it's not even about the integrations that I talked in the class today. It's just about OAuth. You could spend 4 or 5 hours just going through the OAuth dance. There's this amazing instructor, Emmett. He's like a master instructor in Salesforce, and he teaches it. And I was his co-instructor on that. And oh my gosh, there are so many nuances you could study and really know the intricacies of OAuth.
That sounds like fun.
So
Steve.
I would
4 hours on that.
Yeah, you know, I want to say I love integrations, but it did get a little dry. OAuth for 4 hours.
That's rough. Steve, how do you talk to, I was just curious how you talk to your customers about this thing that comes up a lot, which is real time versus near time. So, everybody they say they want real time, right? But, in a lot of cases, there are a lot of constraints there on performance, and, a lot of times folks can actually get away with near time methods. But I was just curious on your take. This just keeps coming up over and over again in the ecosystem.
So we're talking about the scenario of I'm in Salesforce, I'm on a page, and I press a button or action, and I need to go outside of Salesforce and come back and have a response. And so the conversation, we're going to use the conversation of there's real time, which means I press a button, I cannot move forward until I am given a true or a false. That's real time, request reply. That is the integration pattern. Then there's one where I want to submit it and I can wait 1, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, maybe even 5 minutes. So that's near real time, anywhere from, let's say, 10 seconds to 5 minutes. And then there's fire and forget, where I come back later and check up on it. Clients always love to say they want real time. In case of real time, you have to have your UI, you have to have your Apex, you need to do your request response that can't exceed the 5, or I get what are we up to, 10-second call out limits on an Apex call out. It used to be like a cut 5, and now it's up to 10. One thing now, the conversation with the clients is, do you really need to stop the user from moving forward? Do you want to let them hit submit and have them see like a spinning circle and then be able to come back later and see the progress? Or do you really need to stop them in their tracks? And if you really need to stop them in their tracks, make that call out, then you need to handle error handling. What if it times out? What if it throws an error? What are you going to show the user? And then what are you going to tell the sysadmin behind the scenes that it threw a user? So yeah, there's a lot of discussions. And so I just really get to the clients. Do you really need to wait? And if the answer is yes, then you're ending up going to have Visualforce doing an Apex call out, or you're going to have your LWC doing a call out. You might even do a slightly delayed asynchronous Apex call out, but then have the screen kind of do the spinner and disable the buttons. Does that make sense? So I just have that discussion. Do you really, really, really need to stop the user? And if the answer is yes, you got to write that code and handle it. If the answer is no, but I don't want them to wait very long, then you put them into the submit. You do the asynchronous. You have the little spinning with the tracking the thread progress, and have a way for them to come back if they closed it and see it in progress. Does that make sense?
It does. It's
I know
really
I didn't
helpful.
answer your question. Yeah, I just
No,
tell them, do you really need to stop the user?
Yeah, it's helpful. I think one of the things we run into a lot is when, there's some sort of external system and it's, feeding Salesforce based upon something that's happening, in that system. So a change happens in the external system. There's this desire to immediately get that fact available in Salesforce. But it's way more performant if you can um, spread that out, if you can do that asynchronously, if you can park some of the logic on the Salesforce side to sort of pick up those pieces and assemble them instead of trying to pass over everything related. So things that you can do asynchronously help with scaling. But folks are always like, well, I absolutely need to know right away, right? And it's not always really
Well,
quite
so you're talking about incoming
yeah.
synchronous versus outbound.
You're right. I am. Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's a different use case, because if you're on a screen and you go outbound, you really just say stop or don't stop. Put the big stop, wait for the response. Now you're on inbound. Now the question's not about synchronous or asynchronous. You're talking about latency. What's the latency to feed into Salesforce? And yeah, I mean, there are always, you want to know when something changes on system A and push into B, Salesforce is B. You need to know. Immediate call. So you're talking about an immediate call in versus like a delayed response?
Yeah, I mean, we often get this, we need to know right away, but you really need to know right away. Could you know 5 minutes later? Could you know 10 minutes later? And just in terms of performance, right? You have the ability, for example, if you can have a little bit of latency, you can use, batch or bulk, right? You can, you can group things up. You can use fewer calls. You can push some of the processing over to the Salesforce side. Maybe run some sort of a batch process periodically that does some of the heavy lifting on the Salesforce side instead of doing it externally and making more calls. But these discussions come up a lot, and I just wonder if you run into a lot of these kinds of questions.
You always run into, it's always, I'd love to go as close to real time as I can with that, unless I'm hitting I got to worry about hundreds of thousands of rows. I don't say go real time, but if two systems are talking, do you poll? Do you go 5-minute intervals, 2-minute intervals? You can't go too soon. You can't go, because then you got to worry, what if you do get a big batch and you go every 2 minutes to poll, and then it takes more than 30 seconds to process and secondarily process, and then you got to worry about the overlapping if one call overlaps onto the other due to a huge volume. So you want to space things out, but not, if you can space things out an hour, why not just space them out 5 minutes? Does that make sense? Why go beyond a normal gap? And then, so I like systems to say and think, but if I see a big load, why not go hourly? And if you've got to process 500,000 records, then certainly don't go every 5 minutes on 500,000 records, then go hourly process them. So yeah, it's definitely like go as close, small of intervals you can, unless you're being bound by large sets, large processing, and then space them out just enough. Does that make sense?
It does. I think that's a good right down the middle strategy.
Yeah. And if somebody says instantaneous, you get them to justify it, and then you let them know the cost.
Fair.
So Corey's question kind of intertwines with what I was getting at. Obviously, Corey and you were just talking about an API, a call. Why does everyone make it sound like event-driven architecture with an event service bus is the best way to handle huge amounts of data, when what you just discussed made perfect sense to, you don't really need to know every 30 seconds or sooner that something happened? Am I missing something here?
So event-driven is a really powerful paradigm, and we could have a whole talk on platform events. And it's really neat because I was just up at Dreamforce, and for my architect group, we had a special session where the guys who are writing platform events code for Salesforce gave us a whole thorough walkthrough of the architecture. I think it's an amazing tool, but I think people, so yes, there's a great use cases for platform events for listening to like a stream of change and catching the ones you want and taking action on them. So if you have this tsunami of possibilities of things that could be changing, this is changing, that's changing, you're inside of an enterprise and this account's changing, this order's processing, this happening, then you're going to publish events on a bus, and all these events are going to be flying, and you register for those events, and if you see one that's of interest, you consume it. If it's not, you're not published to it, you just let it go by you. If you tried to do that same volume on an API, then you would have to have they would have to, and they being and again, we're talking about client server, we would have to have, I'm being rooted on. So we would have clients. I've been found out. And so if we had a client server where they were broadcasting, yes, we're all working at home under interesting conditions. So where somebody was broadcasting, the advantage of the event bus is the person sending the message doesn't need to know who's listening. One system could listen, 100 systems can listen. So I don't need to know about them. If I were talking to a client server system, I need to know who they are. So just a moment. Thank you, gentlemen. All right.
I appreciate
So sorry about that. I have my future programmers. Here. Sorry, all of us have, sorry for being interrupted. We're all homeschooling. Where's my other one? Duncan, come over here. Since you've interrupted, you got to go on camera. Yes, please. All right. Sorry, go away. There we go. Twins. So the point is, platform events are a great tool where you have a lot of data flying around, a lot of systems, and you don't want tight coupling. APIs, SOAPs, REST web services are good from point to point. I'll stop right there.
Is that the first one or the one that wouldn't come on camera?
Oh, let me see. They're having fun. That's the first one. All right. Sorry about that.
No, don't be sorry at all.
All right. Put down the mask from Venice. Okay. Sorry.
But it's
He's
a cool
now having
mask, Steve.
All right. That's good to go.
That's
All right.
cool mask too.
Yes, they're saying it's a really cool mask. Thank you, Ronan. Wait, Duncan, you're gonna come on the camera. All right. Sorry, we all are feeling the joys of homeschooling. Come on. All right. No, leave these alone. Okay. Hope I answered that under duress.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. All right, gentlemen, please.
That's awesome, Steve. My kids are older now, so they don't do that anymore.
So I am the math teacher, the science teacher, and the PE teacher. My wife is the language teacher, the history teacher, the writing teacher. So I'm sure we're all teachers now.
Y'all are my teachers because I don't have any kids. So thank you. I appreciate the lesson.
That's awesome. Mine are older now, so we have different different challenges because they're teenagers now. But I've got them doing yard work and making sure they get their homework done. But thanks so much, Steve. Does anybody have any other questions or any other discussions? I have to admit, and this is, I hope I didn't turn the recording button off instead of on. Steve, can you tell if we're recording or not?
I think it said we've started recording, but you turned it off and on more than once, so I wouldn't touch it again quite yet.
Okay, I'm not going to touch it, and I hope that it's been on. If not, Steve, you're going to share your slides, and it's okay with the kids. I love it. Earlier I had my husband was in the office and the kids were running around, so they're like, "Are you on camera, Mom? Are you on camera?"
Yeah, we'll definitely share the slides. And here's the irony: is we're the Phoenix developer group, but yet we could have people call in from anywhere. So that's the interesting part of this.
I'm so glad to be here.
and we can do more of this. Yeah, thanks, Corey, and thanks for joining in. And we can do this a little more. Steve and I will see what our schedules are like. I'm going to save before we shut off. I'll go ahead and save the chats because there's been people that are posting tips and questions. I posted, Melissa, the Cactus Force session recording. You can also go to cactusforce.com, and the sessions are on the the link is up on the top of the page, and you can go and peruse the different sessions.
I found that, but I wasn't sure what session Jitendra was talking about.
It might have been the
directly
was
to
it the large data?
Session?
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Was that a link directly to the particular session? I haven't pulled it up yet. I did save it.
It's for all the sessions.
Okay.
I wasn't sure which one. Again, there's not, the title didn't quite match up, but
right.
There's, I believe there's one that talks about large data volumes, and then there was another one that might have been applicable. But look through all of them, and then let us know. We're both. I don't know if Steve, you want to throw your or private message Melissa with your information.
I saved his information already.
Okay.
And like I said,
Misty
gave me your Twitter handles, and I had gone already to your website and tried to figure out which one it was, and I just wasn't sure which one they were talking about. I might have seen it and it didn't have a video. I don't know. I thought maybe the hint that there were flip cards might have rung a bell with you guys.
Flip cards.
Yeah.
Is it the Heroku integration?
Well,
that was Mike Norton's talk. Large scale community.
I was talking about event-driven architecture and using Heroku, and that's when Jitendra said, don't use the word Heroku, use ESB. And he told me, because I was thinking about having a session for our dev group on event-driven architecture, and he said that you guys had a really great session on it.
I wonder,
Go
Mike,
ahead.
are you still, Norton, are you still on? Was that one yours?
I'm still on. I covered event-driven architecture a little bit, talked a little bit about Kafka, and talked about how Heroku supports that. But no, it was more about extending the power of Salesforce by using Heroku and its technologies.
Do you remember the title of your?
Sure. I'm looking at it. I'll put the link, the direct link to his session into the. Okay, that's.
One thing I'm not sure that we talked about is the real power I see in event-driven design and event-driven architecture is it allows you to loosely couple various technologies. So if your database changes, if your order management system changes, if your ERP changes, then you just you have those systems subscribe to the event bus, and it's loose coupling is one of the design principles of computing since computing began. It just allows you, it makes it more resilient to change.
I love that.
I wonder if
Loosely coupled and highly cohesive is what I was taught in school. So
yeah, that's its own topic. I love that.
Yeah, I would completely agree with Mike. If the advantage is if somebody broadcasts onto an event bus, an event, they don't need to know who's going to be there. It could be one system a day, it could be 30 systems a year from now, and you just broadcast, and then as long as you have the event source and the events properly identified, you could have all these events from 30 different source systems transmitting messages, and anyone can plug in to the stream, grab the events that are relevant to them. versus if you do like an API calls, you need to know who you're calling. It's a one phone call system or another.
So it was suggested to me that MuleSoft could also act as not only an API, but also an event service bus.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Could you set up MuleSoft to kind of handle that loose connection of items and that routing? Yes, you could.
Do you know any advantages of Heroku Kafka over MuleSoft? You explained earlier that Heroku Kafka has to have its own database and that you have to have the basically an API in between.
That was Heroku Connect.
Okay, not
Heroku
Kafka.
Connect. Yeah,
okay.
Heroku Connect, not Kafka.
Okay. Right. So Kafka is an event service bus that would work that way. Does MuleSoft compare to it, or is it a much better system on the Heroku Kafka end? Thoughts?
I think of MuleSoft as the connective tissue between all of your system. Kafka is something that you can load onto Heroku, and that's like a message bus on steroids. So it follows that pub sub method. It doesn't need to notify its subscribers. It just you publish onto a topic, and then any subscriber, any consumer can listen to that topic. And like Steve said, it doesn't matter when they consume that message. There's replay IDs to make sure that you've got all the messaging and so forth. So people say, well, which one do you choose? Do you choose Heroku or do you go with MuleSoft? Well, they really play in different spaces. Heroku is really great for extending Salesforce Core Compute. It's really great for extending Salesforce for data. And then if you want to plug other tools in, then you can load those other tools in onto Heroku. And the beautiful thing is it's elastic, so you can have that. You can just fire up more dynos if you need more compute power. There is one similar product to MuleSoft in terms of integration. It's an ETL tool called Xplenty, and you can take Xplenty, run that on top of Heroku, and you can do a lot of integration. It has a lot of connectors to things like SAP and MySQL and Azure and Salesforce and so forth. But that's really where the similarity, that's the only overlap, is when you load Xplenty on top of Heroku and have it acting as your API manager, your integration tool.
So Xplenty is kind of like MuleSoft.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Who is that talking?
Hi, this is Mike Norton.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Do you spell Xplenty EXPLENTY, or is it XPLENTI?
The second one, but it ends in Y.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the new spelling.
Just so you know, we're really happy to have Mike a part of these conversations. I took his place. He's the former co-group leader, and he's also a platform architect at Salesforce. So just so you know.
Thank you, Mike.
Oh, you're welcome.
So much talent in Phoenix. Oddly enough, if it weren't for the virus, I would be in Phoenix in person right now, possibly with all of you. So I would say
well,
that
you're here with us.
Yeah, it's great that I can be with you virtually, but it just occurred to me that were it not for the virus, I would actually be with you in person, which is a little odd.
Well, you'll have to make sure and look us up when you do make it down here, because we love visitors. I do.
Where are you out of again?
Oh yeah, Corey? I was able to come in for Cactus Force, which was amazing. Well done, guys. It's really very good.
We'll find a way somehow to have Cactus Force 2021. We'll have it when people are, if and when we're grouping together. I still wonder if there's going to be a TDX or a Dreamforce this year.
Really hope there's a Dreamforce, because the first day of the pre-scheduled Dreamforce is my birthday. So I was really looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's definitely, this has changed so much. But we're going to need to secure a facility for 2021. And
so here's
right
a funny
now
story. I was presenting at Dreamforce. My kids were in town. I tried to smuggle them in. They wouldn't let them in. I had a borrowed badge. Shouldn't be saying that. But tried the borrowed badge. They're like, no kids. It was a shame because I was about to speak and hopefully going to have my kids. But the security was really tight. But it was cool.
No kids.
Futureforce.com coders.
Yeah. Well, Steve's also got he started the Kid Force, so we have some Saturdays where we've got families and bringing in their kids, and we get some of the different parents that are doing Trailhead with their kids. Actually, that's one of the things. I've got one of them at least doing Trailhead. It's like he doesn't say he's bored. It's like, okay, work on some Trailhead.
Yeah, they're doing. And they're doing code.org where they're writing code on code.org. So
Yeah.
we're gonna make programmers out of them.
Yeah.
Nice.
Awesome.
I hope everyone enjoyed the session.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And I hope that the recording, I wish GoToMeeting wouldn't have so radically changed their interface, because it's like, okay, I used to be able to tell if the recording was on, and now it's not obvious anymore. But either way, I will save the chat, saving it now, and yeah, save the chat, and Steve will have the slides for you guys, and we'll let you know. So we didn't have any swag or anything. We do have a small postage budget. I have small things like camera. These are things that if you've come in person, they're the little camera covers, the little Salesforce camera covers, and I've got little small things that I can send out. So if you guys, I don't want you to necessarily DM me your addresses. I'll send out, see, I've got everybody's name here. So I'll send out the post meeting from our Trailblazer emails. And if you guys want me to send you a little something, just put it in the US mail. Just send me back your address, and I'll send you something.
Yep.
I really appreciate that,
great.
Marissa.
Great to have you there. Go ahead and link LinkedIn if you like and join us. And if you enjoyed the content, post, let us know just so we can be out there. So I have a couple of barbarians that need to be corralled. I may have to drop in a moment.
Yeah.
Marissa,
we were all barbarians once.
Yeah, I appreciate your offer. I still have to put in my swag order. It does not make any sense for me to ask you for any swag.
Oh, no worries. I actually ordered a whole bunch right before the all this happened. I was doing my quarterly order, so I've got a lot of little stuff.
Yeah, a year ago today, I would have been like, all the swag. Now I'm like, okay, I have a budget for swag. Yeah. No, not necessary.
No worries. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining. I appreciate you taking time. I know it's probably crazy times and probably, long work days and everything. So thanks so much, Corey and Melissa, for joining, and everybody else that's on the call that stayed and listened. And everybody stay safe, stay healthy. Lots of, hand washing, hand sanitizer.
Yep.
Thanks for covering my favorite topic. I really appreciate it.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Have a good day.
you so much. It was great.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.